Baldwin 60,000. Now, I want to stress before I even begin that the reason I put this locomotive on the list is because it is a failure in the financial and commercial sense. But on paper, it really isn't that bad. Let me try to explain. The Baldwin 60,000 was actually a celebratory build conducted by Baldwin themselves, in recognition of their, well, 60,000th locomotive. From a design standpoint, they were trying to make it so that this would be the best locomotive they had ever built, period. It has 3 cylinders, weighs about 318 tons, including the tender, and was rated to haul about 6,400 tons, with a top speed of 70 miles per hour. It's actually a high-pressure steam locomotive, and I mean high pressure by the standards of the time. It was built in 1926, and its boiler pressure ran at 350 psi. Towards the end of the steam age, some other locomotives would get pretty close to that by default, but in the 1920s that would have been considered high pressure. It had a lot of really innovative, unusual technology in it too, like a water tube firebox, which was meant to improve efficiency. It also was actually a compound locomotive. She could expand the steam once inside the cylinder, and then again in the 2 outside cylinders. She was meant to stand as a model for future development, and Baldwin was taking a big risk when it came to making her at all. See, generally, when it came to companies, especially back then, a locomotive builder like Baldwin would often wait to receive orders with specifications for locomotives from the buyer. The railroads would tell them what they wanted, and they would build it based off of their instructions. Oh hey UP, what's up? We need big chungus. Here you go! We love it! They did occasionally do it like this, where they would build a design on their own and then sell it later, but there was more inherent risk, since with the former plan, when the railroad approaches them, they already have a buyer lined up for what they're building. In the 60,000's case, they had to sell it, and by sell it, I mean market it, convince the railroads that they would want it. And that's where she fell completely flat. No one wanted her. At all. They received 0 orders for what was, at the time, one of the most technically advanced locomotives on the planet. Why? Why on earth would nobody want her? Well, there were a few reasons. For one thing, that water tube firebox I mentioned. Yeah, see, those tubes were actually prone to burst inside the firebox. They hadn't really worked out how to prevent that. That was a bit of a no-go. Also, her being a compound worked against her, because while that did improve efficiency, most US railroads had actually rejected the entire idea by the 20s just because it complicated the workings and the maintenance of locomotives. Also, she was big. Really big. She was a Ford 10 driving wheels in the 1920s. Due to her weight and length, she wasn't suitable for most lines. Only the heaviest and straightest rails could accommodate her. And as a result of all this, she received no buyers. Which is unfortunate because you gotta appreciate what Baldwin was trying to do here. It shows their technical prowess. Even though she is flawed, they probably could have worked out the kinks, and she could have been great, but she never had the chance. Fortunately, despite the fact that no one else seemed to love her, Baldwin did. They kept her around, and eventually donated her in 1933 to the Franklin Institute of Science in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And she's still there today. The EMD/Progress Rail SD70ACE. Boy, howdy, that designation is a mouthful. I'm just gonna call it the AC. I think that'd be easier to say, in general. This locomotive is actually a pretty recent build, first running in 2004. They were built by EMD not because they were looking necessarily to make a new diesel, they had to, due to EPA Tier 2 emissions regulations. Their older models didn't cut it. They had to develop something new to actually meet those standards, and out popped the SD70ACE. Now, at the time, these diesels were equipped with the latest technology, and EMD did wind up producing quite a few of them, just over 2,000. They were constantly built between 2005 and 2015, when EPA Tier 4 regulations came into effect, making it so that EMD couldn't build these either. They had to make something else again. And from a mechanical perspective, they did function. Like, they could move around. The engines were fine. The problem was, well, partially the engines technically, but also the cabs. For one thing, they were nicknamed Thunder Cabs by railroaders because there was a problem with the... Please shut that off! These things are loud. So loud. They were loud enough that BNSF banned them from leading trains due to them being so obnoxiously loud. And they caused excessive vibration. Crews hated it because it was noisy and shaky. And that wasn't the only issue. The cabs just weren't very good at all. They had a very unique design. Outwardly, they looked pretty standard for comfort cabs, but they weren't internally. There actually wasn't that much space inside of them. A collision also determined that the cabs weren't actually very safe. The cabins were prone to being separated from the main unit and flattened in collisions, which, that's actually horrifying. Did they fix that? No, they never actually fixed that. Most of them are still in service at this point, because, again, they do work, but I wouldn't want to be the crew on them. The Rail MK5000C, which I am again just going to call the 5000C. Why do all these modern diesels have to have the longest designations in the universe? You know, I think EMD started this trend. What is the matter with you? These diesels were actually built by MK Rail. If you haven't heard of them, I don't really blame you. For a long time, they actually did rebuilds of existing diesel locomotives that were originally built by EMD and General Electric. But in the early 90s, they decided they were going to compete directly with those companies by building their own unique diesels. Now, at the time, on paper, the MK5000 should have been pretty impressive. It was 5,000 horsepower, and when it was introduced in 1994, it was the most powerful single prime mover diesel-electric locomotive ever made. The reason for this is that MK chose to use a Caterpillar diesel engine, specifically a Caterpillar V12 3612. That engine was huge. It actually remains one of the largest engine blocks used in rail service in North America in general. It was an insanely powerful engine, and on paper it should have done really well. Except that I've discussed Caterpillar engines being used for rail service before. They don't work well for this context. See, there are a lot of different forces that get applied to locomotives that don't get applied to other vehicles. Caterpillar is known for construction equipment mostly, backhoes and excavators and bulldozers. Relatively slow equipment. It doesn't get jostled around all that much, at least when it comes to the actual engine. But on a locomotive, that's not the case. Not only is the engine traveling at a much higher rate of speed in general, but stopping applies a ton of different forces. Then there's also the act of coupling and uncoupling, which can cause vibrations that it wouldn't be accustomed to. The point is, the engine wasn't built for this. First of all, they didn't sell, any at first. Demonstrations were pretty unsuccessful, and MK Rail didn't have a lot of money for the program. Before any railroads committed to purchasing them, they terminated the program entirely, so they never even really got a chance to do anything. There were 6 built though. They were leased briefly to BC Rail, and then they were finally sold in 2001 to the Utah Railway, a Class 3 railroad that operates in, Utah and Colorado. They wound up taking all 6, and the diesels didn't even last 1 year. Seriously, every single one of them failed within a year of operation due to problems with the main bearings on the Caterpillar diesel engines, as well as the Cato main alternator. The Caterpillar engines just didn't cut it. They couldn't handle the active railroad operation. So they were sent back to MK, which was actually now Wabtec because they were bought, to have both their alternator and their engines completely replaced with EMD equipment. They were reclassed with the designation MK50-3, and they were put back into service. After they were re-engined and completely changed, they actually were totally fine. They're actually still in service now. Not with Utah, though. They were sold to the Kyle Railroad instead, a regional railroad line that runs in north-central Kansas into eastern Colorado. So yeah, the 5000s were garbage, but at least they got re-engined and work now, so that's something, I suppose. The Reading Company C1A class. Now, there are several reasons why you don't see this very often. This is a 444 locomotive. Now, these locomotives were built pretty well. 4 of them were produced, and they were so committed to the 444 layout that their front trucks and rear trucks were basically identical. But physics can be a very cruel mistress in some cases, and as it turned out, this setup was not good. It did not work very well, due to instability. Like, dangerous, very, very dangerous instability. Like, these things will absolutely kill somebody instability. The crews couldn't keep them under control, and they threatened to fly off the rails at any waking moment. After a year of this nonsense, trying to fix the problem to no avail, they rebuilt them entirely to 442 Atlantic locomotives. Apparently dropping those extra 2 trailing wheels fixed them, because they were fine after that. They were reclassified as P7SAs. For the record, not every 444 was necessarily a failure, but a lot of them wound up being rebuilt. It seems like it's just not the best wheel arrangement overall, likely down to an adhesion issue. That was probably an issue with the C1As too, but no one really noticed, because the crew was trying not to die. The Heman Locomotive. What the... I don't even know where to begin. Why? Why do I find this stuff? Why must I enter this domain? I just need to keep reminding myself that I chose this path. I just really didn't think I'd ever get this far. And now I'm looking at something that I don't even know how to begin to describe. The Heman Locomotives are actually a group of 3 different experimental locomotives that are considered steam-electric units. Let me say that again, just so we're clear. These were steam-electric locomotives, and I mean a serious attempt at this idea. I'm not talking about Switzerland's weird ones, because those I understood. In their situation, with the coal shortage, it makes sense for them to do that. This was built this way from the ground up, and the way these work is not the way you think. Okay, let me try to explain this madness to you. The first prototype was built in 1894 by a man named Jean-Jacques Heilmann, who registered a patent for a self-powered electric vehicle. The design was intended to eliminate the unbalanced oscillatory moments as well as hammer blow that was caused by the cranked action of a conventional mechanical steam locomotive. It used a balanced steam engine to drive the locomotive via an electric transmission. Heilmann was a bit of a dreamer and a big thinker. He wanted to create a machine that was very suited for high-speed trains, but without high costs of electrified infrastructure. Electricity was still pretty new in the late 1800s, and the infrastructure wasn't all there. Railroads weren't necessarily keen or simply couldn't afford to invest. This way, they could have some kind of electric vehicle, but not have to have the extra infrastructure. The earliest design was of a train set consisting of a vehicle with a triple expansion steam engine, as well as a generator, a tender, and 3 carriages. The whole train ran on bogies, all of it, and it used a distributed traction system provided by 12 axle-mounted electric motors in the 3 carriages. So it almost sounds like an EMU, but with steam? Okay. But the first real locomotive was a prototype of just the locomotive. It had a boiler, the steam engine, the electric generator, and motors built into a single locomotive. It was named Fusée, or sometimes called La Fusée Électrique. In English, that means the electric rocket. The final product wound up with a 600 to 800 metric horsepower, 2-cylinder horizontal compound steam engine with transversely mounted cylinders of 425 and 650 millimeters. It was supplied with steam by a Lentz-type boiler. The engine had a fixed cutoff with no reversing mechanism at all and no speed governor, excluding a centrifugal overspeed safety device. The firebox was of a stainless corrugated type. The steam engine was used to drive directly a DC dynamo, rated for 500 kilowatts. It was a 6-pole machine with the armature constructed on the Graham dynamo principle with 6 brushes. The generator's field coils were energized by a separate bipolar dynamo capable of generating about 100 amps at 100 volts. That's 10 kilowatts, which was directly driven at approximately 300 RPM by a 20 CV 2-cylinder vertical compound steam engine of similar design to the main engine. So yes, it had 2 different steam engines for this. This second generator's output was also used to provide a supply for electric lighting in the carriages. So that's nice. Electric speed and load control was obtained by reducing the main generator's field excitation current coming from the 10 kilowatt dynamo using a 12-step drum rheostat. The 8 traction motors, I repeat, 8 traction motors were connected in parallel for low speed control the motors could be series connected in 2 sets of 4 that were also connected in parallel. The motors were located in 2 4-axle bogies, with wheel set having a sealed axle mounted 80 to 100 metric horsepower, giving it a dodo wheel arrangement. It was actually a cab forward design too, because Heman really just wanted to make the whole thing weird for the late 1800s. Now, as ridiculously complicated as this is, believe it or not, tests show that the design actually kinda worked. It used 50% less coal than a conventional steam engine would have, and it rode extremely smoothly. But the problem was everything else. It was complicated. Very complicated, and thus maintenance of it would be a total nightmare and very expensive. Also, it was rather heavy for the rails of that time, and no further examples of this prototype were built. But Heman was not done. You fools! Do you think you could stop this man? This is Jacques Heilmann, and he moved on to even bigger ideas. He built 2 more larger prototypes in 1897, 8001 and 8002. They once again were of a similar concept, steam engines that drove an electric generator. Because that's how this is happening now. The things weighed 124 tons and were 28.35 meters long. Once again, they didn't actually function, and believe it or not, this time, some railroads did show some interest, but still decided against it in the end, just due to the complicated nature of this idea. Steam engines were already a thing. They knew how they worked, and they knew how to make them function. Why add electricity on board of a steam-fueled thing? It just didn't make any sense to them at the time. But in Heilmann's defense, this tech was very ahead of the curve, actually. Yeah, they weren't picked up at all, and they failed miserably. But these designs are actually ancestors of modern-day diesel-electric locomotives, which do use diesel engines to create electric power. It's a similar concept. It was just using steam instead of diesel. It didn't work, and nobody wanted it, but Heman was ahead of the time thinking outside the box. And you have to give him credit for at least being very creative. He was obviously pretty smart. He did something unique. It didn't turn out well, but I give him props for the attempt. The Egyptian steam motor locomotive. Egypt? Hey! Quick! Someone call Lara Croft, it's time to go tomb raiding! Don't think we've had Egypt before. Mr. Worldwide all over again. It's what I do around here. I try to talk about all the countries, but there's a lot of you people. Anyway, this is, as I said, a steam motor locomotive. We have discussed these in the past. The steam motors are basically just miniaturized steam engines. And the reason why you would want to have a bunch of little steam motors instead of just one massive steam engine is that it can be more efficient in some applications. They weren't super popular, but when they worked, they did work. And Egypt actually had a very, very, very specific reason for wanting to test out a steam motor locomotive. See, Egypt has some terrain that's very sandy. And sand is a problem for anything that has to move. I mean, nobody likes sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. For a normal steam locomotive, sand can be a maintenance nightmare, and the thought was that if they utilized more enclosed steam motors, it might minimize maintenance overall, because sand would have a much tougher time getting into the steam motors. Not a bad idea on paper. 4 of these engines were actually built by the North British Locomotive Company of Glasgow in 1937, in association with Sentinel actually, and they were meant for passenger service. They were numbered 24413 through 24416, and they were given to the Egyptian State Railways in 1938. Sentinel was the one who built the steam motors, and each locomotive had 2 of them. They independently powered the 2 driving axles. Sentinel's steam motors actually had already been proven to not need that much maintenance, and had favorable consumption rates for steam and lubricating oil. So again, on paper, this should have gone well. Except sand is sand, and no matter how hard you try, if you've ever been in any place with sand, look, it will find a way. It's going to get everywhere. Everywhere, even in places you wouldn't expect. And eventually, the sand did manage to worm its way into the steam motors. Something that was not supposed to happen, or at least not as bad as it was. And due to the enclosed nature of the steam motors, once sand got into them, it was really hard to get out. So they actually did the opposite of what they were supposed to do. They were worse on maintenance, not better. They were taken out of service rather quickly, and though they were used during World War II a bit due to motive power shortages, it's not known what happened to them after that, though it is believed that they were all scrapped. I put them low on the list because I do feel that if they had been in pretty much any other kind of environment, they probably would have been alright, but they were meant to operate in the desert. You had one job. You couldn't do it. The Camden and Amboy Railroad 080 Monster. That's a... wow. And this is a very early steam locomotive. So again, I'm putting it a little lower on the list because it was 1837. There was still a lot of experimenting, and some people have gotten on my case about this, where sometimes I will put an experimental something on any of these lists. And apparently I shouldn't do that, because, well, experimenting is how you learn. And, you know, you're right. That doesn't mean I can't make fun of bad ideas and point them out. I can still talk about them. And very rarely will I ever call a designer of one of these little gadgets stupid, because often the people behind this kind of stuff aren't necessarily dumb. There are exceptions. They are trying to figure out what worked. That doesn't mean I can't make fun of what didn't work. And, well, in the Monster's defense, it kind of worked, but the design used inclined cylinders, which drove a front lever that in turn drove the third axle via a connecting rod with bracing. Okay, why would they want to do it this way? I have no earthly clue. To call it weird would be a massive understatement, though perhaps they thought it would transfer the force better? Or maybe they didn't trust only one side rod, so they wanted more than one? I don't know, but it actually caused more problems than it solved. For one thing, it was more complicated because, I mean, look at it. And while it did offer the advantage of having the front two axles free to swivel to a limited degree, making it actually somewhat articulated, this was accomplished with the gearing between the two pairs of driving axles. Those gears were really stressed. All the time. So stressed that the teeth on the gears would actually break off. Now, admittedly, the Monster is looked at as at least, well, independent thought. It was an interesting idea. It did not work, and was largely considered impractical, but it was fascinating and still is. And all but the original was actually rebuilt into, well, it still had that slanted cylinder thing going on, but it looked a bit more practical. This was believed to have been done sometime in the 1860s. They were remodeled as 460s, and the rear three axles were coupled in the normal way, simply retaining the weird slanted drive. But, to be fair, this did eliminate the troublesome gear issues that had plagued the original design. So, these guys did kind of evolve into something that could be used. With their gears no longer breaking, they were functional steam locomotives, so I can't be too hard on them. They were kind of fixed. The Italian State Railway's Turbine locomotive of 1933. Oh boy, I'm talking about Italy, and I feel like you guys over in Italy get a little sensitive about this kind of stuff, because I have gotten comments before saying that whenever I bring up Italy, it seems like it's only bad things. Well, first of all, how much shade have I thrown at British Rail? I think the British have way more right to be mad at me at this point. Though, admittedly, I have talked about good things from their country too, and I throw shade at everybody, especially on list of worst trains ever. I'm not saying Italy has never made a good locomotive, because, well, you have. And if you guys have any examples of good stuff, by all means throw it at me and I'll see if I can put it on best trains ever. You know, it's just one of those things. I am not so nationalist that I pick and choose which countries I like and which countries I throw shade at. Like, I am an equal opportunity shade thrower over here. Except when it comes to the Dutch, because the Dutch harass me, so I don't like them as much as everybody else. But besides that, I have nothing against you, Italy. And I'm glad you guys are here. That being said, your turbine locomotive in 1933 was not very good, but to be fair, this is not Italy's first attempt at a turbine locomotive, and the original attempt was actually way earlier than you'd think. It was built in 1907, and it was a conversion of an old 060 tank engine, This would make it one of, if not the smallest turbine locomotive I've ever seen. It's a teeny tiny little baby, and it seems to be more designed as a test bed rather than anything else. Very little information regarding its performance is known, but it lasted 13 years before it was dismantled, so it couldn't have been that bad, and again, this was an experiment, and frankly, I think it's actually kind of cute. So, I mean, without knowing exactly how it performed, it's hard to say, and 13 years is definitely a lot longer than the vast majority of steam turbines I've ever talked about. Most of these don't even last 10, so, you know, good work, Italy. Your second attempt was a little bit more radical, though, and I don't even know what I'm looking at. What is this? What is happening? This is the Beluzzo Breda turbine locomotive, and y'all need to chill. This is unspeakable madness. Everything about this is ludicrous to me. It looks insane. It is such a monstrosity visually, and you may think I'm just judging a book by its cover, but the truth is I have no idea how this thing worked, or how well it worked, because no one seems to know. There just isn't a lot of actual documentation on this thing, but what is known is that the Italian state railways actually wouldn't allow it to be run on the main line at all, which does not bode well for how reliable it may have been. But even that was better than the 1933 attempt, which was numbered 685.410. This was a rebuilt Type 685-262. It was meant for express service for the Italian state railways, and it had a steam turbine mounted at the front. It had no condenser, and it is known to have been tested at least once, and then never heard from again. Why? Well, apparently something was wrong with the design, because the turbine bearing seized up, which caused severe damage to the blades. It wasn't repaired. They just didn't bother with it after that. It broke almost immediately during the testing phase. So yeah, like most places, the whole steam turbine thing just didn't go super well for Italy. It's not like they're the only ones. Yeah, but they had that little tank engine. Hey, that was cute. I still like this thing. The Thuil cab forward. What kind of monstrosity is this now? I feel like I am digging the bottom of the barrel to find the weirdest possible nonsense experimental locomotives I can possibly find. This was a one-off cab forward that was a 446 built in 1900 in France. It was to the design of one M. Thuil. Now why in the heck did this thing look so weird? Well, judging by the name, part of the idea was to make it a cab-forward design, which for 1900 would have been pretty ambitious. However, this thing has a pretty major problem, and that's the crew arrangement. The firebox is in the back, like with a typical regular steam locomotive, and they just stuck a cab in the front. In that way, the fireman and the driver are not in the same place, and therefore would struggle to communicate over the sound of a steam locomotive in between them. And it's not even like a camelback where they're, separated, but they're not that far apart. They are literally on opposite ends of this thing. And it was pretty long. Another problem was weight distribution. Only 39% of the weight was on the driving wheels, which is not a good ratio for adhesion purposes. It must have inhibited tractive effort in that regard. Also, with the cab in front of the boiler like that, how do they access the smoke box? For cleaning purposes? I mean, I guess they could take the cab off. They would almost have to be able to do that. But then again, the boiler itself was kind of weird. The wheel's boiler isn't circular. Lateral stays were fitted to hold the two sides together, and each side also appears to have been reinforced with some sort of girder. It's bizarre, and there doesn't seem to be any advantage to this layout in any way. It seems like there was just a lot of things about this locomotive that were done because Thuil may not have known entirely what he was doing. Most of the mistakes on here are kind of amateur outlooks, things he just obviously didn't think about or didn't think were big deals, and it would come back to bite him because his invention totally killed him. For reasons that aren't clear, possibly due to an adhesion issue, the locomotive derailed on one of its trials and tossed poor Thuil into a line-side pole, which killed him. Although, this is only one account. Another account kind of paints him in a worse light, where he just leaned out too far, and then got hit by a pole that way. Either way, it would be his undoing, and without the will to promote it, no one wanted to persist with the design. It just didn't seem like the best way to make a cab forward, and frankly, it wasn't. When it comes to steam cab forwards, it's usually best to go with oil firing, because the crew then can at least be in the same place. Durango and Silverton numbers 1201 and 1202. Ooh, this is a very recent disaster, and looking at them, they look like perfectly serviceable diesels. Very nice livery. They're on wooden pallets, though. Oh goodness, this is not going well already for them, is it? I actually kind of feel bad for these pair of twins because, well, it's not their fault their builders are completely inept. These were two custom-built MK5000Cs, narrow-gauge diesel locomotives that were built by Motive Power and Equipment Solutions Incorporated, or MP&ES, of Greenville, South Carolina, sometime between 2018 and 2020. No one's quite sure on that. And they were built for the Durango and Silverton Narrow-Gauge Railroad in Durango, Colorado. They were rebuilt from two former Tri-Rail EMD F40 PHL-2s, which were standard gauge diesels, and they were originally supposed to enter service in 2021. However, instead, they were placed in indefinite storage due to a lawsuit between the railroad and MP&ES. Why? Well, frankly, the diesels were complete and total disasters. And I mean disasters. You're probably looking at two of the worst diesel locomotives ever constructed, which is embarrassing because they were actually rebuilds. And I just have this funny feeling that they probably worked just fine prior to that happening to them. The backstory here is that between June 1st and July 11th of 2018, a wildfire that was called the 416 fire was started and burned a total of 54,130 acres, 10 miles north of Durango, Colorado. Because of that fire, the railroad had to temporarily suspend operations, and after the fire was extinguished, there was a rumor that burning cinders and sparks from one of their steam locomotives actually started the fire, with many businesses and residents filing lawsuits against them, even though at that point they hadn't actually determined what had caused the fire at all. But to be fair, in July of 2019 it was determined that it was a cinder from one of their steam locos. It certainly wasn't on purpose, but that is something that can happen with steam locomotives in really dry environments, and railroads have to be mindful of that. Following those lawsuits, D and SNG announced they were making some major changes to their operations, including converting most of their operable steamers from coal to oil burners, which would remove the cinder issue. They would also acquire two new custom-built narrow-gauge diesel locomotives, 1201 and 1202. They were supposed to be delivered in late 2018 and early 2019, but mechanical issues and design flaws delayed delivery till September of 2020. But you'd think with the extra time they would make sure that the diesels actually, worked? You fools. You underestimate the ineptness involved in this situation. When they were finally delivered, it was discovered that the internals of these diesels was an absolute mess. There were a ton of design flaws, and there were missing parts. They were flawed and incomplete. The railroad was literally given two diesels that weren't even finished and had been delayed. They were furious over this and proceeded to file a lawsuit that wound up being so severe that MP&ES filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy on February 25th, 2022. During this, they actually are still delivering parts for 1201 and 1202 at a pretty slow pace. How many parts were missing on these things? Why did you even give them to the railroad in this kind of state? It's been years, and these aren't like out-of-use steam locomotives where you have to custom make a whole bunch of parts for them. They are diesels, I assure you. There are plenty of manufacturers well-versed in diesel parts. Even if these are custom built, and they are, to be fair, you cannot tell me it would take years to put it all together, especially when someone's paying you to do it. As of the making of this video, as far as my research shows, 1201 and 1202 are still sitting in storage, because they still don't have the parts they need to actually work. It's embarrassing. It's not known what's going to happen to them after that. If they get their parts, they might actually function, it's true, and maybe the railroad could use them, But this has gone on for so long that I wouldn't blame them if they were just sick of them and scrapped them anyway, or even sold them to another operator. But who the heck runs a business like this? I mean, honestly. You delivered on an unfinished product. Of course you got sued. Tallinn Railway's number 5, the lawnmower, or sometimes called Rolt's Folly. Now, hold a moment. Tallinn? You mean the first heritage railway in the UK and, in fact, in the world? And yeah, that's a narrow gauge railway. Now, we've talked about plenty of times before, but their number 5 isn't called the lawnmower. Their number 5 is a diesel called Midlander. Well, yes, now it is, but the original number 5 was called the lawnmower, or again, Rolt's Folly. It was actually delivered to them in October of 1952, but it was powered by a Model T Ford engine. So it actually ran on gasoline, not diesel fuel. That's fine, I mean, it was small, it could run on a small motor, no big deal, except for the small problem that, that motor was third hand, not even second hand. It was third hand. I mean, it was from a Model T, so you know it was old. It was actually taken from Tom Rolt's narrow boat, Cressy. It was withdrawn just the next year, because the engine seized up on a market day train. Given its age, I'm surprised it lasted that long. It was put to the side, and eventually its frame was converted into just a flat wagon. The flat wagon actually still exists at Tallinn, so technically this locomotive is in preservation, just in its altered form. And it's actually in the process of being restored back to a locomotive. I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, it failed miserably, but I mean, I guess it is also a part of the railroad's history. And in its defense, it was kind of slapped together, and its only downside was that it was using a really old engine. But Tallinn was definitely financially strapped in those days. Spending the extra money just wasn't in the cards for them. It's considered one of their pioneering locomotives, and I guess it is nice they're trying to give it another chance. So maybe someday this little gasoline devil might actually be running on the rails again. The New South Wales C34 class. Aha! Australia. These steam locomotives were built by the Everleigh Railway Workshops for the New South Wales Government Railways. They were constructed between 1909 and 1910, and only 5 were built. They were 10-wheelers, 460s, and they were an attempt to produce a larger, more powerful, and faster version of the P6 class, also known as C32s. They were not successful at this at all. It was found that they just weren't really any better, and arguably worse. They rode really rough, like really, really rough, making them unsuitable for many, many lines. They shuffled them around a few times and actually still used them for a pretty decent amount of time. They weren't retired until the 1950s. So, I mean, they're not the worst things in the world purely based off that alone, but they could only work in very specific locations. And when they dieselized out there, they were one of the first things to go. There was actually an attempt to preserve them. 3402 lasted until 1962 in storage, but unfortunately the preservation attempts failed, and all 5 of these somewhat unsuccessful but still well-loved locomotives were scrapped. The DSB Class MY 1201 and 1202. Okay, now we're actually getting into the legitimately bad stuff. The last couple, you could kind of argue they still had their good points and, you know, financial restraints and things like that. But here's where we're starting to get genuinely terrible. So I have already taken my antidepressants before I even begin this conversation. These 2 diesel locomotives were built by Fricks in Aarhus, Denmark, which I'm probably pronouncing terribly, but you know what I mean, I hope. In 1957 and 1960. The locomotives used a diesel engine that was produced by Burmeister and Wayne, and another company, Thrige Titan, delivered the electrical equipment. Due to the somewhat curved and fancy appearance, as they were very nice-looking diesels, the first one was actually named Marilyn Monroe. Yes, really. And the second one was named My Fair Lady. But beauty is only skin deep, and deep inside they were awful. Just disgusting diesels, like some of the worst that the Danish railways have ever had to utilize. Period, end of story. They were awful. They were unstable on the rails to begin with. They didn't ride well. which is unusual for a diesel and generally a very bad sign, but even if that could be overlooked, they were completely unreliable. They were frequent errors, and they both spent more time being serviced in the shops than actually, running, which is literally the opposite of what you want. That's atrocious. And they were an incredible disappointment. The design was not repeated for them. They lasted in operation until 1969, when they were officially retired, and both were scrapped in 1971. The R46 New York City subway cars. Oh, New York City subway? We've talked about them before. The R46 is an EMU that utilized the third rail to run on the New York City subway. These specific cars were meant to work on the B division of the subway, and they replaced all the remaining old-style R16s and some R10s that were still being used at the time. The R46s were built between 1975 and 1978. A total of 754 of these were built, and they are still in service, but that's only because they were refurbished later, between 1990 and 1992. Why is that? Well, frankly, they were absolute garbage. They were completely awful. The Pullman Standard Rail Company did an awful job with these, and I'm being real with you on that. They were trash. For one thing, the deliveries were delayed due to a strike that occurred at Pullman. That's not entirely their fault, I would imagine. I'm sure that was a complicated situation. But during their first few years of service, several hundred cracks were found in the trucks of the R46s. Not just one or two cracks, no, hundreds of cracks. That's legitimately horrifying. And because of this, they were actually referred to as the most troubled cars ever purchased, which is a bold statement. As someone who spent a great deal of his time talking about terrible locomotives, as well as full-on train sets, I don't know how much I completely agree with them being the absolute worst ever, but they were pretty bad. They had to actually minimize their use because of how bad the cracks were getting. Hundreds moved into thousands of cracks, and they had to be replaced with R44 type standard trucks in order to make them workable. Oh, yeah, by the way, that was, of course, not their only issue. In July 1979, Pullman Standard told the MTA that the handbrake assemblies for the R46 were actually problematic, which is also alarming. Oh yeah, that same month, inspections revealed that the steel where the car body was joined to the truck was wearing away. Which is... what? Was everything on these falling apart? They weren't that old by this point. They were only a few years old. What the heck? It wasn't until, like I said, between 1990 and 1992 that a full rebuild of these cars was carried out by Morrison and Knudsen of Hornell, New York. That seems to have fixed most of the issues. They're still running now, like I said, in rebuilt form. So this is one case of a really, really, really bad train that was actually corrected. So rest assured that as of now, running on the rails, they probably aren't currently disintegrating. But they were. The James Tolman locomotive. This is an old one, and it's a duplex. No. Well, yes, actually. It's the same concept. I know it doesn't look like it, but it is. It's just like the S1 or the T1 on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Just, doesn't necessarily look immediately like a duplex on the surface. But I promise you, it is. And it was very bad. This was a simple locomotive, a non-compound, but had 4 cylinders. 2 of the cylinders sat outside the frames, and those drove the rear set of driving wheels, while the 2 cylinders under the smoke box, the inside ones, drove the front driving wheels. This seems like a really weird way to do a duplex, because that basically means it would be a 4-1-1-0. Why? There was no mechanical connection between the 2 separate drives, and this was not the first time a duplex had been attempted. This was in 1892, and an earlier one happened in 1882. That was the Teutonic class. They were the largest of several compound engine types built by Francis Webb.
They were really bad. They were notorious for wheel slip and jerky starting, and the James Tolman did nothing to fix any of these problems. For one thing, it had a very unusual boiler that was composed of two joined near-circular sections. Quite why this was done this way is unclear, as there was no inherent benefit to doing it, but they did. Also, no one seems to know why it was even named James Tolman. That was not the name of the designer. The locomotive was designed and financed by Mr. Winby of London, and built by Hawthorne, Leslie and Company of Newcastle, England. So, James Tolman is, an unknown individual. Maybe they just came up with the name randomly. No one seems to know, but either way, he probably wouldn't want to be associated with this anyway. It was unsatisfactory in tests due to a lack of steaming power, and it was really prone to failures, just in general. It was unreliable. It also had really bad wheel slip, which is a very, very, very duplex thing to have. Even the later T1 and the S1 were known for having that issue, though by that point, had the steam age lasted longer, the Pennsylvania Railroad may have actually been able to work out how to correct that issue. But in those days, the late 1800s, no one had any idea how to fix this problem, and it failed on a near constant basis. Mr. Winsby actually became disillusioned with the entire project, and eventually just abandoned the whole thing. There's no word on exactly what happened to the locomotive, but, okay, look, it was scrapped. It's not around anymore, it's gone. I don't know when it was gone, I don't know how long it lasted, but the last time that I know it existed was in 1893, so it probably didn't live that much longer after that. It was bad. It was a bad locomotive. That's what you're here for, isn't it? This is what you wanted! Are you not entertained? The Thailand State Railways, CRRC CDA 5B1, or sometimes just called the Ultraman locomotives, due to their coloration, resembling the Japanese superhero Ultraman, yet seemingly not being nearly as powerful, or at least, well, in practice. These were manufactured by a Chinese company, CRRC Kishuyan. I'm not sure how to say it. And these are very recent. The first 20 of them arrived just last year, in January 2022. They are considered a significant step up compared to the locomotives that Thailand had been using, which were starting to become very, very, very out of date. They have improved horsepower to 3,218, diesel electrics, with a maximum speed of 120 miles per hour. Thailand has very good hopes for these, but based on direct sources among my fan base, that doesn't seem to be entirely the case. Now, actual data on these in terms of their current reliability is very scant, I've found, at least on my end. Some countries are easier to research than others, and Thailand is one of the ones that makes it very hard for me. But I do have some residents of Thailand among my following, and they are the ones who specifically asked me to talk about them because they are not currently happy with them at all. Apparently in the first year of operation, they suffered multiple breakdowns while pulling passenger trains, which is really a bad sign, because passenger trains for these locomotives should be pretty easy, especially compared to the heavier freight, and yet they're consistently breaking down, which is bad. It's also hilarious because most of the articles I have found about them talk them up as a great thing for Thailand and how their test runs went perfectly. Everything is fine, absolutely. And yet in the first year they're breaking. That's not good. Now, to be fair, and this is the reason why I'm putting them low on the list, there is still time to fix these. It's only been a little over a year since they entered service, and teething troubles are not unheard of when it comes to a new locomotive. But, on the other hand, if you were to, say, purchase a car, and it kept breaking down within the first year of you having it, you would consider that a lemon. Like, that's not a good thing. It's bad. It's very bad. And I would understand if these were minor technical difficulties, but straight up breaking down? I mean, come on now. But again, it's early. So the verdict's still out on these. I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, at least right now. But a few years down the road, if I'm still hearing bad things, well, I'll let you know. Bombardier's HR616 diesels. Bombardier made freight diesels? What? But yes, they did, in fact. And they didn't last very long at all. And they didn't do very well at all in terms of sales. They sold exactly 20, and no more. And the reason for that was, well, there were a few. For one thing, Bombardier had never done a diesel quite like this before or since. And the HR616 designation, well, the HR stood for High Reliability. Marketing, everybody. convinced they were going to be really reliable. I mean, they were using an Alco prime mover, the 251E, and they were 6-axle, 3,000 horsepower freight locomotives. And they did have some pretty decent technical innovations. For example, 2119 actually was the first diesel on the railway to feature a desktop-style control stand, but they lasted only a little over 10 years. And that was because, frankly, in operation, they just weren't that impressive. Apparently the high reliability thing was just marketing because they weren't that reliable. I mean, they weren't terrible, but the problem was, once they failed, fixing them was a technical nightmare, and that only inflated maintenance costs. Plus, competition was steep in the freight market. You had EMD and General Electric sitting around, Bombardier barely had a way in, and when one of their only attempts at it was not ideal at all, that kind of made it so that no one else was going to buy from them. Canadian National retired them by the end of the 1990s, with every single one being scrapped. The MR63. Man, I have gotten so many comments about this ever since my list of failed train modifications, because people were like, actually, Darkness, there is a rail line that does use rubber tires, and that's the Montreal Metro in the city of Montreal, Quebec. So, you're wrong about rubber tires not working. Yeah, take that. Well, first of all, I didn't say they never worked. In fact, I said the opposite. There were some benefits to them, but the maintenance never made sense, at least when you compared it to steel wheels. Now, the MR63s did have a pretty long life, working on the lines from 1966 until 2018, and they built 369 vehicles, 123 sets in 3-car formations, as well as 41 sets in complete 9-car formation. However, out of that, 0 are still in service, and only 1 was preserved. And yes, indeed, they do use a setup that utilizes rubber tires, which do have some benefits in terms of stopping time and overall traction and things like that. There are a few transit systems in the world that do utilize this setup. And some of those use a central rail, like the SUVs from Jurassic Park, to guide the train, where the tires run on basically just the ground like a normal car. And that seems to be easier on the rubber tires altogether, but the MR63 didn't work that way. It worked like a typical train. There were 2 rails. However, the MR63, as well as the Montreal Metro as a whole, is kind of an example of why this really is not a good idea. Even though they're still using it, and they built it, they might as well, the reliability of this setup is seriously questionable from a maintenance perspective. It still is. Reliability levels of the MR63s in particular were more than double that of typical North American subway cars, with normal steel wheels. More than double. And you have to remember, the entire Montreal Metro is underground. These trains do not have to deal with the weather at all. They're always underground, and still their maintenance costs are through the roof. The MR63s were notorious for this problem, and as they aged, obsolete components and parts availability meant they got even worse. Ride quality diminished very quickly, as suspension systems and the rubber spring packs started to harden with age. Now, to be fair, they were getting very, very old, so I wouldn't necessarily ding that against them necessarily, and the rough riding was not attributed to the tires or the tracks, which were well maintained and regularly replaced. But do the costs justify it? If you ask Montreal, apparently yes, because they are still using this setup, and the whole reason they chose it is because of the benefits of rubber tires. The stop time is shortened, and they can go a little faster. But how worth it is it with how much money you're sinking into it? That's kind of my question. And it doesn't seem like I'm ever going to get a solid answer on this. Some are going to point out in the comments that, hey, I don't think these trains are that bad. And maybe you're right. They have gotten significant use, but that seems to be more out of stubbornness than anything. Personally, whenever I hear maintenance costs, the last thing I want to hear next to it is more than double everyone else. But if Montreal can afford it and wants to pay for it, that's on them. I guess they are kind of neat. The Indonesian SS1000 class. Ooh, I'm knocking 2 things off the list here for this, because to date I am still harassed by the Dutch, and lately, the thing they've been saying a lot is Werksvoer, which is their historical locomotive manufacturer. I also have some Indonesian fans who want me to talk about this particular locomotive, and good news! This is a locomotive that ran in Indonesia, but it was built by Werksvoer! Haha, there you go, Dutch! I hope you like what I'm about to say about you. Alright, so what was wrong with these? Well, on paper, it should have been nothing. They were Pacifics, but they were designed to replace the preceding Pacifics that couldn't keep up with increasing demands. So Statsvorwagen ordered new ones that were supposed to be more powerful, built by Werksfor. The unique thing about these Pacifics is that they were 4-cylinder, compound designs, which is really unusual for Pacifics. When you hear 4 cylinders and compound, you think of a Mallet, but that's not what these were. So the setup was quite bizarre, and they had superheaters, piston valves, and feed water heaters, making them fairly modern for 1920. The problem was that Werksfor had never built anything like these ever before, and decided to use Indonesia as a bit of a guinea pig for testing this whole setup. As it turned out, while on paper they probably should have been pretty good, if you ask the actual Indonesians, no, that's not what happened. Apparently the 4-cylinder compound setup was not done very well, at least in this case. Maintenance on them was a Christmas nightmare due to that, and they did not pull nearly as well as the preceding class of Pacifics, even though, again, on paper they absolutely should have been able to do that. Many trains had to be double-headed as a result of this, which is like the opposite of what they were supposed to do. The frustrating part about this for Indonesia, because they were considered a Dutch colony at this time, which is why they had to deal with Werksfor, they didn't have a lot of say in what locomotives they received, so they were kind of stuck with them. Which is why they continued using them so long, because even though they were a complete pain in the butt, they did function, technically, just not as well as they were supposed to. They actually stuck around through World War II, even to the Japanese occupation. The Japanese redesignated them C-53s, and some of them apparently still operated even into the early 1970s. And though solid data is very limited in terms of what happened to them, I believe at least one is in preservation, C-53-17, which has at least 2 recent color pictures of her. So, hey, that's something. Are you happy now, Dutch? I talked about Werksfor. I also talked about, like, one of the worst steam engines they ever made. You're welcome, by the way! I hope you spam my Discord more for this, because this is what you get whenever you do that. The British Rail Class D2/1. I would ask that you all excuse me for just a moment. Alright, now that I got that out of the way, let's discuss the D2/1, because in my video about the North British Locomotive Company, I brought them up and said they were bad, but I didn't go into detail, and when I did that I realized, oh no, I have no other option but to actually make a video involving these and go into some level of detail. But truth be told, there isn't that much information, because it didn't last very long. NBL only built 8 of them, and they were all withdrawn between 1963 and 1968. Every single one was scrapped. But why were they withdrawn like that? Well, there were 2 main reasons why these were bad. One wasn't exactly their fault. It was just because British Rail had ordered too many shunters. They had so many different classes of shunters, just all over the place. They had over 900 08s. Why? Why did you need that many? They didn't. They absolutely didn't. And there was no point to using these when they had so many others, especially ones that worked better and were standard. These were diesel hydraulic, not diesel electric. And British Rail would eventually settle on the standard of diesel electric. But that wasn't their major problem. The problem isn't brought up directly in most articles about it because, again, information is scant. I feel like a lot of the locomotives on this list were like that. You guys made this one really hard for me. I actually had to work for this, so thank you for that. Now, the main problem with these is that they used Paxman engines. Now, Paxman is a diesel engine manufacturer, and some of the engines they made were actually pretty good. But the design they were using for this particular locomotive was, not. For reference, the D2/1s shared the RP engine with the Fell diesel, the British Rail 10800, the British Rail Class 07, and the New South Wales Government Railways 41 class. If any of those sound familiar to the more astute among you, it's because every single one of them has appeared on previous installations of Worst Trains Ever because they were all terrible because the engines were trash! The RP engines were not good at all, and I assure you they weren't any better in the D2/1s. They were absolutely atrocious, completely unreliable, and failed constantly. So even if the D2/1s were standard, utilizing them was not a good idea. And as I said, they were all scrapped. Although, weirdly, River Eden, which is a shunter at RAF Luchars, which I'm hopefully pronouncing correctly, was built to the same specification as the D2/1 and is preserved. While she isn't technically a D2/1, she is nearly identical, I guess with improvements to the engine to make her actually work, which is probably helpful. Thank you for that. Just, wow, I just can't believe you. Why would you do this to me? Why? I thought you were gone. I really thought I was done, and yet here we are. You're welcome. The London and Northeastern Railway Class U1. Ooh, a Garrett. A 280 plus 082, which was actually built specifically for banking over the Worsborough Bank, which is a steeply graded line in South Yorkshire and part of the Woodhead route. This thing was actually the longest and most powerful steam locomotive to ever run in Britain. Period. End of discussion. And it was constructed in 1925, designed by the legendary Sir Nigel Gresley, built by Bayer, Peacock and Company. Hey, all this sounds great actually. And it was designed for banking and, well, did it do that? Well, yes, in the technical sense, sort of, kind of, not, well, okay. It had a lot of problems. Crews hated her, just so much, just about as much as they could, mostly because she was a pain to work on and required a lot of effort to keep functioning. They received no extra pay for using her, even though she was twice the work. She had a very nice cab because of her size, but she had to go through 2 silkstone tunnels, and because she was a banker, she was always behind the train. So she was the last of 3 steam locomotives to enter the tunnel, meaning the crew always got a big old dose of smoke and heat, and they tried to compensate by giving them gas masks, but that required the crews to share the gas masks, and they hated doing that because gross, so they just covered their mouths with wet handkerchiefs like real men. She was adequate at her job, but not very successful. That's the main reason why she was one of a kind. They never made another one of her. She suffered damage to her firebox pretty early on and that had to be replaced. And she was never able to steam very well and was a big baby about coal. Just a big, whiny baby about coal. And by that I mean she just couldn't run on low quality coal. A lot of locomotives could get away with that, but she couldn't. She needed only the best coal, and lots of it. Now! When the route she was designed to run on was electrified, they had no need for her, but they decided to keep using her anyway, and moved her over to the Lickey Incline to help supplement another banker, an arguably more famous one, Big Bertha, who was a 010. Bertha was known as being much better at her job, and though the U1 tried to help out Bertha, she still wasn't great at doing this one basic thing. They tried running her chimney first, but they couldn't buffer up the passenger trains very easily, so they ran her backwards, but that meant the crew had trouble seeing, and after only a year trying to do this, they just moved her back to Mexborough in November of 1950, and she was placed into storage. She was actually put back into service in 1951, and they tried to convert her to burn oil to deal with that poor coal quality problem, but the design didn't take well to oil for whatever reason. She was finally withdrawn on the 23rd of December 1955 and was cut up in 1956. She was in service for a pretty long time, but it's hard to call her a successful locomotive when the entire time she spent working, she did it while making her crew's life absolutely miserable. And being a big baby about the coal thing. Now seriously, do not give her a bad coal. She'll cry. Literally. The General Electric steam turbine locomotives. I debated putting these on this list, because I guess in the technical sense they were kind of ambitious, but they didn't really work very well at all. And yes, I know they look like diesels. Their cabs kind of look like the E or F series from EMD, except with really long noses. But no, these were by General Electric, built for Union Pacific in 1938, and yes, they are steam turbines. They were going for a bit more of a futuristic at the time look to make them distinctive from classical steam locomotives, because they obviously didn't work quite the same. They were delivered to Union Pacific in April of 1939, and there was much fanfare around them. There were a lot of publicity events, calling them the future of railroads, and they weren't at all. Perhaps technologically speaking, they were fairly advanced. These were the first steam turbine locomotives ever built in America, and they had a lot of cool new technical innovations, like dynamic brakes, for example, but they had the same problem that pretty much most turbines do, in that they're really bad at low speeds. Really good at high speeds, really bad at low speeds. But for Union Pacific, that wasn't really the issue.
They only lasted 6 months, which is horrible for any locomotive ever. Like, that's a horrible, horrible career. It's actually one of the shortest operational careers ever recorded for any locomotive, and the reason is their reliability was garbage. They didn't work half the time, and when they did break, they were really expensive to fix, and were continually expensive to maintain in general. They could go very fast and were very powerful, but that didn't matter when they cost so much to utilize in the first place. Union Pacific sent them back General Electric, asking them to fix the problems, and they were still interested until December of 1941, due to the development of other types of locomotives that would fill the niche that these were meant for, but with much more efficiency. The turbine thing just didn't seem like it was worth it anymore, though even after that General Electric did continue tinkering with them anyway, and New York Central wound up testing them for a bit, and they worked better for them because General Electric had made a bunch of improvements by that point. They still didn't want them, however, and then in 1943 they were actually also operated by the Great Northern, but again, they really weren't interested in actually using them for any length of time. They just needed them during the power crunch of World War II. They were retired that same year and returned again to General Electric, and they were both scrapped before the end of World War II. In retrospect, a lot of historians seem to think that they were still technical marvels, and they were, but they have to actually be, workable, usable, affordable. They weren't any of those things. Technically advanced, yeah, but that doesn't mean they were good, and they weren't. The SNCF Class X 72-500. These are a little bit more recent, but they were constructed between 1997 and 2002, and a total of 117 were built, and there's still 85 in service. These were built for SNCF, which is the French national state-owned railway company. They're diesel multiple units built by Alstom, and they were meant for long-distance transport express regional and intercity services, most particularly in the areas south and west of Paris. These come in 2 different types. There were 92 car sets built, and an additional 15 3-car sets. 3 sets can actually be coupled together when that's required, and their maximum speed is 160 kilometers per hour or 99 miles per hour, which isn't that bad. And a lot of the tech that went into this was actually very advanced. For example, the onboard computer system could quickly diagnose failures within the set, so any problems could be managed swiftly. And that was really good to have, because boy, howdy did they have problems. The reliability is seriously questionable. They actually have a very bad reputation over in France, and continue to even to this day. For one thing, when they first introduced, they were savagely uncomfortable. Nobody liked riding on them, and they actually had 2 different retrofits, one in 1998 and another in 1999, to address both passenger comfort as well as continued operating problems. Even by 2006, recurrent problems still existed with these, mostly with their electric system, as well as the devices that were meant to open and close the doors, which you may recognize as fairly important. Obviously, they weren't complete garbage as France continued to use them, but then again, maybe they just didn't have a choice. It may be one of those cases where they just didn't have enough money to spend on getting different ones after they already invested in these, so they just kept having Alstom fix them, or just fix them themselves. Either way, they are still in use, even though the general public doesn't like them. So, one of those things. Also, am I the only one who feels like a lot of newer trains, like whether they're sets or individual locomotives, just have so many issues these days? Like, what is going on in this industry? Why can we not make competent rolling stock anymore? What is happening? It's bothering me. The Midland Railway Paget locomotive. This one was difficult for me because I almost put it on mad science experiments, because it is, but it was so terrible that I thought I'd just put it here. The Paget locomotive was built for the Midland Railway, designed by Cecil Walter Paget, which is why it's named the Paget locomotive, and it was numbered 2299. There's only one known photograph of this thing, as it was kept very secret when it was being worked on. It was put together in 1908. Paget was the general superintendent at Derby Works at the time, but Richard Dealey was the locomotive superintendent. And apparently those two did not get along very well.
And Paget put together this project because he wanted to, not because the company actually did. He actually mostly financed it himself initially, though he ran out of money, and the railway started making up the difference later. Now, this locomotive doesn't look very weird. It doesn't look like a mad science experiment at all. It looks fairly conventional. It's got a very large boiler and large firebox, yeah, and there was a very good reason for that. See, this thing had 8 Uniflow cylinders. 8 cylinders! Yes, really! This was a 262 with 8 cylinders! Why? What are you doing, Paget? Okay, so the way this worked is so bizarre, but I'll try to explain it. The 8 cylinders, still can't get over that, were arranged in 2 groups of 4 that were placed between the first and second, and the second and third driving axles, with rotary steam distribution valves placed over each of them. A bronze sleeve in the valve body was rotated to control the cutoff. 2 of the cylinders were connected to the forward pair of the 6 driving wheels. 4 of them were connected, 2 on each side, to the center pair, and the final 2 were in the last pair. Those drove a jack shaft which operated and reversed the valves. If it sounds weird, that's because it is. I'm not familiar with any other locomotive, that I could think of off the top of my head anyway, that worked quite like this one. Certainly not with 8 cylinders. I mean, you have more cylinders than you do driving wheels. What are you doing? And, well, it didn't work at all. They managed to tinker around with it for about 10 years, and Paget wouldn't give it up, believing that this was definitely going to work, he promises. But what kept happening was, well, seizing. The phosphor bronze sleeves in the cast iron steam chest kept having this particular failure, and there was leakage in the glands and piston rings. These problems were never solved. In fact, in 1912, one of the rotary valves seized, because, yeah, that's what happens, while it was on a test run, and the engine was blocking the main line for 7 hours. They wouldn't let Paget put it on the main line anymore, and she was sent to storage back at Derby Works. Eventually they managed to scrap her in 1918 just to get rid of her, and they only got away with that because Paget was in France at the time. When he got back, he was probably pretty upset. That was his baby. But I'm sorry, Paget, your baby didn't work. The Australian National BU class. I debated whether I wanted to even put these on a list or their own list, because they're not really locomotives, but they're still a part of a train, and this is worse trains, and I do EMUs and stuff, but they have no power source of their own. These are booster units. Let's go with there. That's what the BU stands for. Of course, if you actually ask the Australian railwaymen that worked with them, they were not booster units. The BU stood for bloody useless. They built 4 of these particular booster units, and they were actually rebuilds of Alco-powered 600 class diesels. In order to make them into booster units, the engines were removed and replaced with 30 tons of concrete. They also put concrete in the original fuel tanks, because why not? Now, why in the heck were they putting concrete in these? Why were there no engines? Well, that's because these are tractive boosters. The way they worked is that they kept their traction motors, and they would basically give the diesels they ran with extra traction motors, on top of the ones already on the diesel. On paper, it would have allowed them to pull the trains a lot better, without necessarily needing an extra full locomotive. Except they didn't work at all. In fact, I would argue that bloody useless isn't really accurate, because they were more of a hindrance. They didn't just do nothing, they actively made the trains they were attached to worse, just by being there. They were that bad. For one thing, they were dead weight above 80 kilometers per hour, because they could not go very fast. So that was already an issue, but on slower trains that probably wouldn't have been a big deal. But they drew too much power from the diesels they were attached to, ultimately reducing tractive effort as a result in some cases. They also had dynamic brakes, which is good. Those caught fire. Great. They realized the problem was a lack of ventilation, so they fixed that. And then they still caught fire. Really, nothing about them was going right. And they were put into storage and scrapped in 2008. Easily one of the worst things that Australia ever created for their rail lines. And I'm not trying to come down on Australia, but this is definitely their low point. It's a box of concrete on top of some traction motors, and somehow you managed to make that catch fire. What?